Hey everyone, everything in web development is changing, and for your career as a developer, it's really important that you understand what's going on and what new things to learn and what not to learn. So I'm going to give you a high-level overview of modern web development with all the things that you need to know right now so you can make $10,000 a month as a modern developer. So let's start from here because a lot of things have actually changed in the past year or so. So I would say the biggest innovation has been these AI Copilot, and these are so good, I have to say. Just to give you an example here, I have a new hook here, use optimistic. We're using this in my PetSoft project in my React and Next.js course. You can see it knows exactly what I want to do here. It can suggest the entire code snippet here for me. Now it does miss the default case here at the bottom, but you can see fix that very easily. Right, so thanks to these AI Copilots, I can sort of forget about a lot of those lower level details and I can reason more in a higher level abstraction about my code. Huge change, and it makes it less important to memorize a lot of things and algorithms. Another major change is actually TypeScript. Now TypeScript has been around for a long time, but in the world of web development, especially React, I would say the past year it has completely broken through and now it has become sort of mandatory. Whereas before it was kind of optional, you would see it around, but now I see it everywhere and it has become, in my view, it has become mandatory to learn if you want to become a full stack web developer. Tailwind CSS, in my view, has also completely taken over. Of course, it's been around for a long time, but now it's also the default in Next.js. And in my view, it's going to become the default way of styling websites and web apps. Now, another huge innovation, of course, is Next.js. Next.js has released their app router. So before they had the pages router, but there's lots of innovation here. It's not just server components. In my view, actually, server actions are the biggest innovation. Yes, there is a bit of a learning curve, but in my view, it's the right way forward. And it actually makes it a really exciting time, in my view, to be a web developer, because now with Next.js and actually all of these tools together, it makes you very powerful as a developer. It makes it very easy to create full stack applications. So I think it's a really exciting time. Yes, it's annoying that as a experienced developer, you have to learn some new things again, especially TypeScript was kind of annoying to learn. A lot of people went through it last year. It's basically a month or 2 months of struggling and then you kind of get it, but that's part of the job. The benefit of being a junior or newcomer is that you can go straight to the latest technologies and you can sort of skip ahead. You can leapfrog over maybe the more senior developers that are still kind of stuck with the old technology, right? So that's the one advantage you have as a newcomer. So how would I learn web development if I were starting from scratch? I want to make 10K a month, let's say. That's what I'm going to show you right now in this video. Let's go through it. So you're going to learn all about how to build modern websites. Now, what about apps? Progressive web apps haven't really broken through yet. People don't want to add something to their home screen. They want to install a native app from the App Store. So how do you do that? How do you convert a website to a mobile app? Well, you could do it yourself, but it's very painful. So instead, you may want to take a look at today's sponsor, which is AppMySite. They make it very easy for you to turn your website into an app. So you can connect, you can just provide your URL, you can change the design, and you can then publish it to the Android and iOS app stores. So in the dashboard, I can create my app here. I can call it ByteGrad, and I already have my website, right? It's bytegrad.com. I can convert it into a mobile app very easily here with AppMySite. So here in the dashboard, I can add an app icon. Right here, I can change the splash screen, which is what you're going to see when you open up an app for a couple seconds on your phone. Here in navigation, I can change that top bar and bottom bar color. I can change the button colors right here. And then of course, you want to test and see what you get on a real mobile app. You can download this on your phone, or right here in the web view, I can press on click start and it will show you how it will look like. So here you can see it's loading up my website right here in this mobile phone. This is what it's going to be. Right here, my latest course. Let's take a look. Right, so you can see it renders this very nicely. And it also gives me analytics out of the box. So I would say check out AppMySite. The link is in the description. All right, so then let's actually take a look at what you need to learn. And so traditionally you would specialize in either front end or back end. My view is that over time it's going to merge together in full stack web development, because a lot of the difficult parts on both sides are being abstracted away for you, right? Next.js makes a lot of things easy for you. So over time as a developer, you're going to work across a wider range of the stack, in my view. Now, regardless of what you're doing in web development, you're going to have to learn the fundamentals. I'm not going to list every little thing you need to know. A lot of those things you will learn as you go. So for HTML, basically you have to take a look at semantic tags. Don't just use divs everywhere. Try to use a section sometimes, an article. All right, so then CSS is really important. Even if you want to learn Tailwind CSS, make sure you master CSS itself first. Very important, the box model. So every element on a page, let's say this button here, has a so-called box model, and you can actually see it here in the dev tools. So you can see it has some of its own size. Basically, this is coming from the text actually in there and how big the text is. And then around there you have padding. And around there you have a border. A border may have a certain size. It doesn't have a border here, but that would add some additional space. And then you have margin, which is essentially space between elements, right? That's the box model. Every element on a page has this sort of rectangular box. Now, to have a nice layout, you want to take a look mostly at Flexbox. You want to use Flexbox, I would say 99% of the time. Sometimes you want to use a grid. So I think you should still learn it as well, but Flexbox should be your priority when it comes to layout. Animations and transitions. So you can see here in this app, I'm using a razor here. When I hover this button here, there's a slight background color that changes. That's actually just a transition. And an animation, for example, when I go to this page, you can see when I load here, I have a bit of a fancier animation here to load this image. I would probably do that with an actual animation in CSS. Also make sure your projects need to look good across a wide variety of devices, and we can do that with media queries in CSS. All right, so for JavaScript, of course, you need to know about variables. You want to store some value somewhere in order to work with it. These days we use let and const. Previously we used var. People have kind of settled on using const as the default, unless you cannot use const because you actually need to reassign a value, for example. In that case, use let. Basically, we never use var anymore. Whenever you have a collection or list of things, you want to put it in an array, and these arrays, they have certain methods, right? So map, for example, in React is very common. For each, you want to go over each one, right? Push, you want to add something. These methods, I think, are important to learn. So then we have objects. So whenever you need to represent something in your code, you can have an object, right? So an object may be, for example, on a real estate website, you may have an apartment, right? And apartments, they need to be represented by an object. So they may have, let's say, some size, right? Square meters or square feet. They may be price for them, right? Maybe number of bedrooms. Right, so this object represents an apartment. We use objects to represent entities in our code. In JavaScript, we have arrow functions, new compared to the traditional function, right? So now you don't have to write the actual function keyword anymore. Instead, you sort of have a fat arrow in the middle here. Whenever you need to reach across the network to get some data, for example, you may want to use the built-in fetch API. So you need to understand how that works. It actually gives you a so-called promise. So you need to learn asynchronous code in general as well. You don't have to create promises yourself. Typically you only consume promises. So if you have a promise that's called P, in order to get its value, essentially to consume it, traditionally you can use .then on there, and then in there you get the value. Or more recent is you can write await in front of a promise, right? So those are essentially the two ways of consuming a promise. Typically async await is preferred these days. And also generally you need to learn about the DOM itself, right? So in the DOM there are certain events. When I click in here, you can see there's a blue line in here. So Eraser, this is a web app. It's hooking into that click event that occurs when I click there, and it's manipulating the DOM to add like a blue line in here. And generally you need to learn a little bit about the web platform with things like local storage, how URLs work, how to communicate with a server, etc. All right, so those are the fundamentals. Now I want to emphasize, don't get stuck too long in here. It's okay if you don't fully understand some things. I would recommend that at some point you just have to jump into it, and you're going to have to learn a library or framework to really become like a useful developer. So let's say we're going to start off with the front end here. We're going to learn about React. There are also other options which I'll talk about, but React is probably the most popular one. If you want to create a React app, typically these days you're going to use a feed. This is essentially a replacement of create React app. So for React, you need to learn about components, right? So a component is just, well, let's say I have some pet form button component. It's actually just a JavaScript function, and we write it with capital Ks. So now whenever I need some button in my project, I can use this component. I don't have to repeat myself with the markup. I can put all the markup inside this one component and then just reuse the pet form button whenever I need that button. But how can you make it different in a certain instance? Well, let's say I need to change the text in here, right? So sometimes it needs to say add a pet, and sometimes I'm changing a pet and it needs to say save changes. How can I make sure that a component can also be changed? I can use props here. I'm destructuring that right here, and I can use that here to change the component in a particular instance. React has so-called hooks. So if you have a piece of data and you want to track of it over time, you want to use state. Sometimes you need to go outside your React app. Maybe you need to reach out to some server, or maybe you need to reach out to local storage, right? Local storage, that's something outside your React app. Typically you want to use effects for that. Custom hooks sound very fancy. It's basically just like a utility function. Instead of writing your use state and use effects, let's say here in your component, you can sort of put it away somewhere else, and that's what people will call a custom hook. So if you have a piece of data, you typically start off by just using use state for that, but it's very common that you will need that piece of data in many different components. And you can use props to pass that around. Unfortunately, it will make your app too brittle. So you want to put that piece of state in a dedicated solution, a state management solution. Sounds very fancy, but you can use the built-in context API in React for that, or something called TwoStand or something called Redux. These are typically the most popular options. Now, I have to say my view on this is that the context API and TwoStand are getting more popular. I actually teach quite a lot of people about React and Next.js in my React and Next.js course, and I have not received one question about Redux so far. So you can take that as a simple data point. I actually think Redux is fine to use. One of the benefits of it is that it has a more sophisticated dev tool, but purely looking at usage, it does seem that TwoStand and the context API are getting a little bit more popular. For styling, I would only go for Tailwind CSS at this point. And then of course, you also need to know about common patterns and best practices. So you want to make sure that your components, for example, are reusable. There's certain things you can do, and also things like state in the URLs. So a piece of data should not always go in use state. Sometimes it's better to make it part of the URL as, let's say, a search param. For example, real estate website, I only want to see houses below $1 million, let's say. I can make that part of the URL, and now the user can bookmark it, and they can come back later and get the exact same view. They can share it with other people and they get the exact same view. And so some pieces of data should go into the URL, most commonly filter or sorting parameters. So that's all React. And what about things like routing, for example? Well, routing, I would argue, is going to come from a full stack framework like Next.js, which we'll talk about in a second. And same thing for React Query. Maybe you've heard of React Query. That is basically how I would do data fetching in a React feed app. But in Next.js, I would do data fetching a little bit differently. I would do it in a so-called server component. So I wouldn't use React Query in Next.js. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, so this is all React. Now, of course, besides React, which is backed by Meta, there is also Angular, which is backed by Google, and there's also Vue and Svelte. These are the most common options you have for the front end. Now notice that I haven't really talked about TypeScript yet. So TypeScript, I would say, is kind of like mandatory. It forces you to be much more precise with your types, which results in much more robust code. But you don't really have to learn it separately, I would argue, as an app developer. You can just enable it in your React apps, and TypeScript can already do a lot of inference, right? So it can already detect when something is going to be a string or a number or a Boolean. You don't really have to specify that very often yourself. I have a video on my YouTube channel about type versus interface. Make sure you check it out. A more advanced concept is generics. In React, you're most commonly going to see that when you create a custom hook. That's what I would do if I was learning the front end. Now, like I said, I think the trend is going to become that you as a developer, you're going to work along a wider range of the stack. So I think the focus these days should be on becoming a full stack developer. So that means now we also need to take a look at the back end. So if we're going to use React, you definitely want to take a look at Next.js. So Next.js has built-in routing through the file system. So depending on how you structure your folders and files, that's how you do routing essentially. And Next.js these days offers server components and server actions. So a lot of the traditional back-end code that you would have in, let's say, a Node.js Express server, a lot of that is now going to be written in Next.js in your server components or server actions. And actually a lot of it is going to be in these server actions. So traditionally, if you had a web server, you would have, let's say, an API endpoint to update some data. Well, you're going to use a server action for that now. And for getting data, typically you're going to do it in a server component, right? So Next.js is a full stack framework. You don't need a separate backend. You can now create complete websites and web apps with just Next.js, with just the React model, which I think is very powerful. Next.js does a lot of caching for you behind the scenes. So that results in some performance benefits. So I would say, by the way, server components are mostly also for performance benefits, and server actions, I would say, is more of a developer benefit, right? So you don't have to create those separate, /API endpoints anymore and then hook it up with the front end. You can just create a normal JavaScript function and it's only going to run on the server. That's basically what a server action is. I would also take a look at more general the concepts of SSR and SSG. They come up quite often and they're actually quite similar. So static site generation, SSG, basically it just takes your components together and it just creates HTML out of it during build time. You can put it on a CDN, so then when somebody comes to your website, it's very fast because it's already there waiting for them, and it's just creating HTML out of your React components. So Next.js is really page focused. So you create a page, and then on the page you have components. So Next.js will actually automatically create HTML out of that whole page with all of the components that are on there. Whether it's a client or server components, it's all going to render that during the build into HTML, and then it will serve it from a CDN. So SSR is actually very similar. It's also going to render things on the server. But when people say SSR, they don't mean during the build, it's during request time. So when I go to a website, it's not already waiting for me like with SSG. As I make that request, it needs to render things on the server and then it will send me a response. So it's more on the fly. And it can do that not just for the whole page, but Next.js can do that for an individual server component, right? Independently from the rest of the app, it can render a component by itself on the server and then stream it to the front end. Right? So streaming and suspense, that's a very powerful paradigm in Next.js, but that's handled for you behind the scenes mostly. All right, so Next.js, we also have patterns and certain best practices like data fetching. Things like data fetching have changed. You typically don't use React Query for that anymore. You typically would do that in a server component. When you submit data, you're going to submit it typically to a server action, and we want to make sure that we validate that data that we get, just like with a normal API endpoint, because you don't know what you're going to get from a client, right? So you want to validate that with something like Zod. Now, since Next.js is a full stack framework and they abstract away the network boundary for you, it's kind of easy to leak sensitive data. So there are certain ways of avoiding that, right? So that's Next.js. Next.js is a React framework. There are other React frameworks as well. So Next.js is actually backed by Vercel, and there's also Remix, which has been acquired by Shopify. So if you're in the e-commerce space, this is definitely something to take a look at. There's also Astro, which seems to specialize more in content websites. And there's also Gatsby, which is backed by Netlify, but I do sense that this is a bit on the decline in terms of usage. So that's all React, right? So that's all React. Now, besides React, we also saw that we have Angular, Vue, Svelte. They all have their own full stack frameworks as well, right? So we have Nuxt for Vue, Angular Universal, and Svelte Kit as well. All right, so those are full stack frameworks, meaning client and server side are both in one framework. So does that mean that you never need to create a separate backend server anymore? And the answer is no. You actually often still need it. And so for example, I was building a startup last year and it had to do some video rendering videos on the server. That's a very resource intensive task. It makes sense to spin that out of your main Next.js app into a separate service or separate backend, so it doesn't interfere with any of the standard things going on essentially, right? So whenever you have some kind of compute heavy or special task, I think it makes sense to spin that out into a separate backend. Now, of course, you may also work with some kind of microservices architecture where you have essentially a bunch of separate services, all little backend apps, and you can use any kind of language for that, right? So the benefit of Node.js is that you already learn JavaScript and TypeScript from the front end. You can then use that for the backend as well. Node.js is the most popular one. There's also something called Bun, but I do feel like Node.js is here to stay. You can create API endpoints, easily doable with something called Express, but also Nest.js are common options. PHP is very popular in the world of WordPress. Actually, it's popular all around, but I would say if you're doing WordPress work, this is definitely something to take a look at. Laravel is a popular web framework for PHP. I just sneaked in Python here as well. Python has become actually very popular because of data science. So now with all the AI machine learning, that's where Python comes in. So if you are close to the data science type of world, this is definitely something you want to take a look at. It has Django as a popular web framework. Java is very popular in enterprise, also used for mobile apps, Android, and Spring is the web framework there. Ruby is also an option. They have Ruby on Rails, and I also see Go a lot these days. So these are some common options you have for your separate backend services or apps. All right, so then for databases, people would traditionally split them up, SQL databases, and then on the other side, you had NoSQL databases. Now, my sense is that the big differences between them have been abstracted away for the most part, mostly through these so-called ORMs. So typically as a developer, you don't deal directly with your databases. You're going to do it through an ORM, as it's called. So something like Prisma or Drizzle, very popular on YouTube, or Mongoose. And they have abstracted away a lot of the differences between these databases. So for example, I can just interact with Prisma, and then no matter what database I use, whether it's Postgres or MongoDB, the code is essentially going to be the same for me. So I don't think it makes a huge difference which option you go with, unless you have some specialized need, like certain performance or storage issues. Some of those differences may actually come into play. Now, I do get a sense that SQLite is growing very fast because it's probably the easiest one to set up. It's just a file that's essentially just part of your app. It's not like a separate server you have to spin up. It's just a file. It does require access to the file system, and that's a problem for if you deploy to a so-called serverless platform like Vercel, where your whole app essentially becomes a bunch of serverless functions. You don't get access to the file system, so you cannot use SQLite, but it's possible that there will be solutions for that. There are also popular what I call hosted database services. So they host the database for you. So Supabase, for example, is just a Postgres database, but they host it for you, and they offer lots of other services out of the box as well. Same with Firebase. And Vercel now these days actually also offers a database service. So that's databases. I typically during development go with SQLite because it's the easiest to set up. Depending on where I host my app, I may have to change it to a, let's say, a Postgres database. So if I deploy to Vercel, for example, I'm going to use their database service, and they actually give me a Postgres database in production. All right, so that's basically the core of it. So if you learn most of that, you're already very far along, but it's also important in my view that you learn the ecosystem. So there are many tools around the core that solve specific problems. So Shadcn UI has actually exploded in the past year or so, and I think it has a great shot of becoming like a default component library for the web. It's basically a third-party set of components, but it's a little bit different than the traditional ones, because traditionally you would use npm install, and then you would not really get the source code of the component. You would get a third-party component, and then if you want to change the component, you had to use their props. Right? Now with Shadcn it's a little bit different. So with Shadcn, for example, if I get the dialog here, when I install this, I get sort of like the source code. So I can literally change anything I want here, customize it exactly how I see fit, and not with only the props that the third-party library gives me. I can literally change everything. Now, the reason you want to use a third-party library in the first place is because it removes a lot of hassle, right? So for example, with a dialog, when you open it up, you want to focus the first input in here, let's say. When I press tab, I'm going to change the focus around here, but notice that the focus is trapped within the dialog here. And so Shadcn actually prevents the focus from going outside the dialog into, let's say, this input field in the background. So there are many little details, a lot of accessibility things that you have to take care of. And actually a lot of that work has been done by Radix UI. So Shadcn is built on Radix. So Radix actually deserves a lot of credit as well. Shadcn is basically a Tailwind CSS layer over Radix UI. So that's a very powerful combination. So I think this is one of the big innovations that we've had over the past year as well, actually. So there's also something called Zod. So we talked about the data on the server side, let's say. So there's some incoming data into your server action. It's just like an API endpoint. You don't really know what you're going to get from the front end. People can send all sorts of crazy data in weird shape, weird formats, and to your server. So you want to validate that what you get is of the shape that you expect it to be. I have a complete tutorial on my YouTube channel. You can do that with Zod. And the cool thing about Zod is you can not only do it on the server side, you can also do it on the front end with your forms. So you may want to use React Hook Form to control your forms. It makes it very easy to deal with, let's say, a loading state and error states in your form. And you can connect Zod to your forms as well, so that Zod can be responsible for the validation. And then with React Hook Form, you can easily do everything else, like displaying an error message for every particular field of the form. So the combination here is very powerful. And actually, you can even use Shadcn because Shadcn also has components for forms. The first three here are actually super powerful combination. Framer Motion, very popular for animations. Instead of using plain CSS animations, you may actually just decide to use Framer Motion for pretty much any animation you're going to do. All right, so for authentication, there is an open source solution called Next.js. A lot of people are a little bit frustrated with it because it's the docs and it's just not a great developer experience right now. And you may actually also want to take a look at third-party options for authentication. So I'm actually a brand ambassador for Kind. It is a paid sponsorship, but even if they weren't sponsoring me, I would still use Kind. Authentication is just difficult to do properly. And a third-party solution has thought about how to do it. And it's also easier to get started in my experience. So I personally would use Kind for authentication. All right, so for payments, Stripe is pretty much the most popular option. Kind is actually also coming out with a payment solution soon, which is actually really powerful because often when a user pays, they get access to some feature, right? So the payment is actually closely related to user management and the roles and permissions they have. So with Kind, you can manage your user, including any kind of subscription or payment related logic very soon with their new offering. All right, so you want to take a look at hosting providers. My channel is mostly focused on React and Next.js. So Vercel is pretty much the most popular popular option because they are actually backing Next.js. I do get the sense in general that Vercel is getting more popular than the other options. So Netlify, for example, is another option. My personal sense is that Vercel is getting more and more popular. So maybe that's a platform you want to take a look at. Of course, Git and GitHub. So the Git is for managing your code base, and GitHub is basically a place to host your Git repository. There's also GitLab and some other options. All right, so then mobile apps. The sponsor of this video, AppMySite, actually makes it super easy to build mobile apps. So that's something you want to take a look at first. If you want to go down the route of doing it completely yourself, there is some innovation here as well with React Native and Expo actually. So there is some innovation there as well that you may want to take a look at. If you sign up for my email newsletter, I'll send you the link to this diagram so you can take a look at this yourself. I know this is overwhelming. There's a lot to learn, but you just have to take it one day at a time, and you'll see that in a couple months you can get pretty far. Now I have a complete React and Next.js course in which you will learn pretty much everything here. So check that out if you want to master all of these. So check that out. I'm Wesley, by the way. I'm a brand ambassador for Kind. And then I hope that this gave you a good high-level overview of where we are currently at in web development. I think it's a really exciting time. There's lots of innovation, lots of things are changing, but if you keep up, things are only getting better. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next one. Bye.